Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for this very important event, discussion on religious freedom in Tibet and the selection of Tibetan Buddhist leaders by the Tibetan people. I'm very pleased we have so many representatives from the NGO and diplomatic communities, as well as media representatives at this event today. Welcome to you all. We have facilitated this event to discuss the key challenge in defending religious freedom in Tibet: the inability of Tibetan Buddhists to select their own religious leaders without interference from the Chinese Communist Party. Today, much of the world's attention has justifiably been drawn to the egregious violations and abuses of human rights, including religious freedom, in other parts of China, most notably Xinjiang. But it is equally important to remember and address the long suffering of the Tibetan Buddhist community and their legitimate aspirations to openly practice their culture and worship freely. As part of freedom of religion or belief is this ability to select one's own religious leaders. In February, 5 UN independent human rights experts expressed their concern regarding the Chinese government's intervention in the appointment of Buddhist leaders and insisted on the rights of Tibetan Buddhists to practice their faith freely and choose their own leaders. The issue of reincarnation of Tibetan Buddhist lamas is one of the most pressing concerns facing Tibet today, one which the Chinese Communist Party has also attempted to interfere with and cynically use for its own political purposes. While His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, defends the rights of Tibetan Buddhists, Beijing, an explicitly atheist regime, has forcibly asserted its claim to control Buddhist reincarnation in Tibet, in contravention of Tibetan religious tradition. Freedom of religion or belief is a fundamental freedom, enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a core document in the history of human rights, and one that is the duty of every UN member state to defend. The UDHR says quite clearly in Article 18, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Defending this right is not just a matter of duty, but also a matter of decency. I'm delighted we have such a great panel today to discuss the momentous issue of religious freedom for Tibet and for the global community. We have Bob Destro, Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues and Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Ambassador Sam Brownback, Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Tenzin Jaiso, Director of Outreach to International Campaign for Tibet. And Dr. Lobsang Sangay, President of the Central Tibet Administration. Before I turn the floor over to our guests, I would like to go over some ground rules for how we'll conduct this event. As has become the norm these days, do bear with us if there are any technical challenges. After the briefing by each of our 4 guests, I will open the floor to questions or brief comments. We ask that you use the raise hand feature to request the floor, and the button should be located on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. If your name and organization are not featured in your logon handle, please send a chat to the host identifying yourself so we may identify everyone properly. I will call upon participants in the order in which the requests are received. Once you're called on, please unmute your microphone. If you wish, you may enable your video by clicking on the video icon at the bottom of your screen. After you're asking your question, please lower your hand, turn off the video, and remute yourself. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Assistant Secretary Bob Destro. Bob is the Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues and dual hats as the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He has a long history as a human rights advocate and civil rights attorney with expertise in elections, employment, and constitutional law. Bob has served on the faculty at Catholic University's Columbus School of Law since 1982 and served as its interim dean from 1999 to 2001. He also taught me First Amendment religious liberty constitutional law. He was a founding director of the Interdisciplinary Program in Law and Religion and served as the director of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies from 2017 to 2019. He served as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights from 1983 to 1989. His legal work also includes collaboration with the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, in a 15-year dialogue among Muslim, Christian, and Jewish leaders in the legal, business, and religious fields in the United States and the Middle East, as well as efforts promoting the release of political prisoners and prisoners of conscience in the Middle East. Assistant Secretary Destro, you have the floor.
Well, thank you for inviting me to join you, and thank you, Ambassador Brownback, for your introduction. I'm truly honored to be here this morning. And so let's begin with the real reason we're here, and that's to celebrate the beauty and richness of the Tibetan culture, to reflect upon the many accomplishments of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and to think together about the serious challenges we face ahead. So let's begin with the golden threads that knit Tibetan culture together: the Tibetan language and Tibetan Buddhism. Together, they are the beginning of our discussion. Tibetan Buddhism is a major world religion whose great teachers and their writings have influenced thinkers and religious leaders around the world for centuries. We don't need to be either Tibetan or Buddhist to recognize not only Tibetan Buddhism's unique contributions to the world, but also the importance of the Tibetan language and the development of its unique perspectives on both the transcendent and the mundane. A word, said the late American Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, and I quote, "is not a crystal, transparent and unchanged. It is the skin of a living thought and may vary greatly in color and content according to the circumstances and the time in which it is used." Unquote. The Tibetan language encodes the Tibetan Buddhist experience and shapes its and our perspectives on the world around us. Our language shapes our faith, and our faith shapes our individual attitudes and communal approaches to that which we value as human beings. Freedom of religion, speech, association, and peaceable assembly are human rights, not because they're useful, but because rather the activities they represent are the foundations of human culture. So let's pause for a moment and consider the enormity of the statement I just made about these are human rights because the activities they represent are foundations of human culture. It is no accident that the Chinese Communist Party claims the right to direct the selection of the next Dalai Lama, and through that process to remake, or in its words, to sinicize Tibetan Buddhism in its own communist image. Nor is it a surprise that the Chinese Communist Party is ramping up its efforts to eliminate Tibetan language and culture. It's doing precisely the same thing with our Uighur and Kazakh Muslim brothers and sisters in Xinjiang, and in its efforts to replace the teachings of Jesus and the prophets with the state-inspired drivel of a patriotic church. This, my friends, is what information warfare looks like. In all it says and done, the Chinese Communist Party aims to control not only the information landscape, but the very thoughts of all whose perspectives and approaches to life and community differ from those of the Communist Party. Consider the case of the Panchen Lama. It's no accident that he was abducted when he was 6 years old. What better way to sinicize Tibetan Buddhism by installing their own pliable and fake replacement who would promote the Communist Party and weaken Tibetan Buddhist individuality while sinicizing the real Panchen Lama from youth, relegating his traditional roots to what Leon Trotsky derisively called, quote, the dustbin of history. Unfortunately, Tibetan Buddhists are not alone. The Communist Party feels so threatened by faith in something other than the party that its leaders are bent on controlling all aspects of religion, from the selection of Catholic bishops and the training of monks to the content of scripture and the succession of Buddhist spiritual leaders. Driven by a need to control anyone or anything that exists independent of the party, Communist Party officials use force, intimidation, censorship, and coercion to shape both the medium and the message. The Communist Party forces Chinese citizens into re-education and slave labor camps, threatens the families of regime critics, censors the brave scientists who sought to warn the world about COVID-19, and corrupt the short-sighted around the world with their bribes. And the Communist Party have the audacity to complain that we are interfering in their internal affairs. When Secretary Pompeo appointed me to be the special coordinator for Tibetan issues, he did so out of not only a deep respect for Tibetans, their language, culture, and religion, but also out of a deep concern over the Chinese Communist Party's abuse of China's religious and ethnic minority populations. The United States is committed to helping Tibetans safeguard their way of life, not just in Tibet, but also in India, Nepal, Bhutan, and everywhere that it flourishes. Within a day of announcing my appointment, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs criticized the United States for interfering in China's internal affairs, as if Tibetan Buddhism belongs to China. It doesn't. Tibetan Buddhism belongs to Tibetans and to its adherents everywhere. If our commitment to human rights means anything, it is our collective duty to bring attention to this unfolding tragedy, for Tibetans' sake and for our own. It is both baffling and completely hypocritical for the Communist Party to criticize our support for the preservation of a major world religion as interference in Chinese internal affairs. The Communist Party does not hesitate to interfere in the internal affairs of its neighbors and of major faith communities around the world. The PRC is controlling its neighbors into signing treaties that would allow for the forcible return of Tibetan refugees to China. Just last month, I spoke to Tibetan youth leaders here in the United States who told me that they have been afraid to speak as U.S. citizens in the United States because of potential Chinese retribution to themselves and their families in Tibet. The Communist Party has no right to impose its regime of speech and thought control on the world. We must certainly object when they wage information warfare globally. The Communist Party has stated clearly that it should control the succession of the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhists all around the world, just because there are Buddhists in China. There are roughly as many Catholics in China. Mark my words, when the opportunity presents itself, the Communist Party will, by the same logic, join the list of governments in history that have claimed the right to influence the election of the next pope. You can bet as night follows day, that will be the claim. The United States rejects attempts by any government to limit the freedom of all religious communities to choose their own leaders, define their own doctrines, and to preserve the internal coherence of their faith. On this point, the United States is completely unified. Republicans, Democrats, executive, Congress, the Supreme Court of the United States, we all understand that religions have the right to control their own leadership. And the United States government understands that the Chinese Communist Party's attempt to control world religions and decisions of sovereign nation states is a major threat to global peace and stability. Together with partners around the world, the United States has and will continue to call on the PRC to provide unhindered access to foreigners traveling in Tibetan areas, including for diplomats and journalists, just as other countries give Chinese diplomats, journalists, and citizens access to their respective countries. The United States adopted the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act to press for greater access and transparency. Today, I call on our like-minded friends and partners to pass their own versions of the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act. Together, we must force the issue by continuing to press the People's Republic to respect the unique language and culture of Tibetans. Tibetan Buddhists are rightfully proud of their language, culture, and religion. Those who live in China can be patriotic Chinese citizens too. I'm honored to serve as the Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues and join you on a path to which so many of you have dedicated your lives. I thank you profoundly for your leadership, for your sacrifice, and your perseverance. And thank you for trusting us to help you, your families, and generations to come resolve these important issues. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for giving me the floor, and I turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for your great remarks. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Sam Brownback, the United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Ambassador Brownback served as Governor of Kansas from 2011 to 2018. He previously served as U.S. Senator from 1996 to 2011 and as U.S. House of Representatives from 1995 to 1996 from Kansas. While a member of the Senate, he worked actively on the issue of religious freedom in multiple countries and was a key sponsor of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. He has also served as the Kansas Secretary of Agriculture and was a White House Fellow in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. I can think of no one else better suited to share his perspective on how the global community can further engage on this issue moving forward. Ambassador Brownback, the floor is yours.
And thanks very much, Ambassador Bremberg, and thank you very much for hosting this event along with the International Campaign for Tibet. This is a very timely matter, and it needs to be taken up by the world community. I second what Bob Destro said. He's really put out the summation of what needs to take place. Look, basically what you have taking place here is the Chinese Communist Party declaring they have the right, they have the sole right to appoint the next leader of a major religion in the world, of Tibetan Buddhism. The audacity of that should be striking to people, if nothing else. And then the thought that they're going to execute on it because that's what they've already done with the Panchen Lama. Abducted him at age 6 and still haven't told the world where he is. Now the issue becomes the Dalai Lama. I had the good fortune of about a year ago being in Dharamsala, India, meeting with the Dalai Lama, meeting with my friend, Dr. Lobsang Sangay, who's on this program as well with the Central Tibetan Authority. Is doing an excellent job there. And I stated there at that time to an audience gathered that the United States supports the Tibetan Buddhists picking their next leader through their historical religious processes that they've employed for centuries, rather than any government around the world, including the Chinese Communist Party. This is a basic, as has been outlined under the UN Charter for Human Rights, this is a basic for religious groups that are entitled to pick their own leadership. And it is amazing to me and galling that the Chinese Communist Party would deem that they are worthy to do this. And I guess, as Bob Destro put it, the next up is the Pope, and they will assume that they have some authority to appoint that next leader because there are Chinese that are practicing Catholics. I want to go specifically to the issues that are taking place right now within China on their war on faith. Bob's covered some of them, and I want to cover a few others. I think we have to call out not only their desire to appoint the next Dalai Lama, which is an absolute ludicrous charge that a government would put forward, but also the breadth and depth of their human rights abuses and their war on faith. PRC officials prohibit the display of the portrait of the Dalai Lama within China. Authorities routinely detain Tibetans for possessing his image. 30 Tibetan Buddhist monks were arrested last year simply for having the picture of the Dalai Lama on their cell phones. The Communist Party repeatedly claims to protect religious freedom, but how can this be when it criminalizes the mere possession of a revered leader's picture? Communist Party also destroys monastic dwellings and other structures important to the study, the practice, and the preservation of Tibetan Buddhism, such as the Larangar and Yachingar Buddhist institutes. These include the forced expulsion of more than 5,000 monks and nuns, many of whom are not allowed to study at other monasteries. In some instances, tourists have greater access to Buddhist temples than the Buddhist practitioners themselves. Is that right or fair? It's not. The Communist Party's interference in the succession process threatens far more than the fate of one or two individual lamas. The beautiful fabric that intertwines the Tibetan Buddhist faith with Tibetan language and culture is at risk every time the Communist Party obstructs Tibetans' ability to live their lives and follow their conscience as they choose. The future that the Dalai Lama envisions for Tibetans is in jeopardy, and the global Tibetan community needs our help. The U.S. government stands with Tibetan Buddhists so that they, like members of all faith communities, can select, educate, and venerate their religious leaders in accordance with their beliefs and without government interference by anybody, including the Chinese Communist Party. We urge others to join us in supporting Tibetans' religious freedom and this fundamental human right. Thank you. Master Bremberg, back to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brownback, for your presentation. I would now like to introduce Tenzin Jaiso, the Director of Outreach International Campaign for Tibet. Tenzin was born in Dar es Salaam, educated at the Tibetan Children's Village School there, and subsequently at St. Bede's College in Shimla, India. She served as elected member of the Tibetan Parliament for 2 terms, during which, among her other work, she traveled widely to Tibetan settlements in India and to speak about religious persecution of Tibetans to various governmental and NGO groups in Europe and the United States. She joined the team at International Campaign for Tibet in 2008 and currently oversees membership and outreach, Tibetan empowerment, and Chinese engagement programs. It is a pleasure to have you here with us today, Tenzin. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Brownback. Thank you. Excellencies, it is certainly my honor today to speak on the topic of religious freedom in Tibet. And this is a topic that lies at the heart of the crisis that has plagued Tibet since its invasion by the PRC over 70 years ago. The suppression of religious freedom in Tibet and the efforts by the Chinese government to control the succession of His Holiness the Dalai Lama are core issues for the survival of the Tibetan civilization and its future. And I really welcome international diplomatic efforts such as this one to raise awareness to support a sustainable political solution. These efforts are needed more than ever today. As a Tibetan, I would like to share what religious freedom and His Holiness the Dalai Lama mean for our people. The Dalai Lama symbolizes Tibetan religion, culture, and identity. The institution of the Dalai Lama and the current 14th reincarnation in particular has been the lifeline of the Tibetan people. There is a strong historical bond that goes back 5 centuries between the Dalai Lama and the people of Tibet, which will be broken if we allow Chinese Communist authorities to dictate and impose their will on this sacred tradition concerning the search, confirmation, and installation of Tibetan religious leaders, including that of a future Dalai Lama. As a representative of International Campaign for Tibet, I call on all concerned to put the question of religious freedom and succession of His Holiness the Dalai Lama at the top of your human rights agenda in all your relationships with the People's Republic of China. As you know, the Chinese Communist government has continued to clamp down and severely limit religious freedom in Tibet with different tactics. From the complete physical destruction of over 90% of Tibetan monasteries during the 1960s, the equivalent of destroying almost every university, library, and art museum in a country, to periods of relative liberalizations in the 80s, to the brutal crackdown imposed on all religious institutions after major demonstrations in 1987 to 89, and then again in 2008, when protests swept the country, and then the wave of Tibetan self-immolations from 2009 until 2019. The Tibetan people have suffered again and again, repeatedly, the destruction of our distinct cultural linguistic identity, denial of basic fundamental human rights, and rampant racial discriminations. Over the last decades, China has taken a radical step to undermine Tibetan Buddhist institutions at their core. In 1995, after the Dalai Lama identified a young 6-year-old Gentu Chögyam as the reincarnation and successor of the 10th Panchen Lama, he's a very prominent spiritual leader in Tibetan Buddhism who died under mysterious circumstances. The Chinese government, as you have others mentioned, reacted by abducting and disappearing the 6-year-old boy and his family, making him the youngest prisoner of conscience of the world. They then replaced him with a Chinese state-sponsored Panchen Lama of their choice. Despite now decades of advocacy efforts and calls from highest levels of government and international institutions, including several times by United Nations Human Rights Special Procedures, lastly in August 2020, to this day, the Chinese government has refused to disclose credible information about the whereabouts of the 11th Panchen Lama 25 years after his abduction. While this could be seen as yet another grave human rights violation by the Chinese government, in reality, such extreme action is part of a larger strategy to control Tibetan Buddhism in its entirety. In 2007, the Chinese government put in place rules and regulations to determine how Tibetan reincarnate lamas are selected and appointed, undermining a uniquely Tibetan Buddhist tradition and ultimately providing such authority to the Chinese Communist Party. This step has been followed by statements by Chinese government officials who've said the process that will lead to the selection of a future Dalai Lama will be guided and determined by Beijing and not by the Tibetan faith system and community, as has been the case for centuries. This action, if taken, will be rejected by Tibetan people both inside and outside Tibet and will not provide legitimacy to Chinese rule. We've seen this already with the imposition of the state-sponsored Panchen Lama, who does not command the respect of the Tibetan people. In response to such illegitimate demands, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has clearly stated, in line with Tibetan Buddhist traditions and with the internationally recognized principle of no government interference in the appointment of religious leaders, he and only he will leave instructions on how the selection of his successor should be conducted and by whom. Most importantly, last August, 5 UN special procedures issued a communication to the Chinese government on the rules on the appointment of Tibetan Buddhist leaders. And they've made it clear that the existing Chinese regulations do not comport with the respect of religious freedom, stating clearly that such rules may interfere and possibly undermine in a discriminatory way the religious traditions and practices of the Tibetan Buddhist minority. Furthermore, the experts appeal to the Chinese government to ensure that Tibetan Buddhists are able to freely practice their religion, traditions, and culture without interference, as freedom of religion includes the right of Tibetan Buddhists to determine their clergy, religious leaders in accordance with their own religious traditions and practices. In addition to the United States government, also the European Union, the governments of Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and others have reaffirmed the respect of religious freedom demands that the Chinese government does not interfere in the selection of a future Dalai Lama. The United States Congress is currently considering legislation that would make it official US policy that the Dalai Lama's succession is a strictly religious issue that only he and his followers should decide on. It is therefore high time for the international community to come together and support the legitimate aspirations of the Tibetan people. And I would like to humbly submit the following recommendations. Firstly, support the call by 50 United Nations independent experts to establish an independent and impartial mechanism at the Human Rights Council to monitor and report on the human rights situation in the PRC, specifically call for the inclusion of issues related to religious freedom as the appointment of religious leaders. Secondly, continue releasing joint statements at the United Nations on the PRC and include the issue of religious freedom in Tibet and beyond, in particular, the issue of the appointment of religious leaders. Thirdly, publicly raise or reiterate the issue of religious freedom and the appointment of religious Tibetan Buddhist leaders in government statements, being mindful of the Dalai Lama's 2011 statement on his reincarnation, and raise the issue with Chinese government bilaterally and multilaterally. Fourthly, in national parliaments, pass resolutions in support of religious freedom in the PRC, in particular with regard to the appointment of religious leaders, and seek expert opinion from Tibetan Buddhist leaders in exile. And lastly, consider including the issue of appointment of religious leaders in the PRC into legislation that sanctions human rights violations committed by the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you.
Thank you, Tenchu, for your remarks. It's harrowing to hear from you the importance of this, and we really appreciate your joining us today. At this time, I'd like to introduce our final panelist, Dr. Lobsang Sangay, the President of the Central Tibet Administration. He is the first democratically elected president of the Central Tibetan Administration following the devolution of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's temporal role in 2011, and is currently in the second presidential term following his 2016 win. He has unveiled the 55 vision, shaping Tibet's political future, aimed at restoring freedom in Tibet and the return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Tibet within the next 5 years, while simultaneously strategizing the Tibet movement for the next 50 years if needed. He is the first Tibetan to earn a Doctor of Juridical Science and has organized an unprecedented series of conferences between Chinese and Tibetan scholars, including a meeting between His Holiness the Dalai Lama and 35 Chinese scholars. Dr. Sangay has received a citation award honoring the democratic institution of the CTA as envisioned by His Holiness the Dalai Lama by the National Endowment for Democracy, and many other awards and accolades. He is a legal scholar with expertise in international human rights law, democratic constitutionalism, and conflict resolution. He has given lectures, published in academic journals, and consulted for media outlets globally. Dr. Sanjay, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Brownback, for the opportunity and kind introduction. I want to thank the U.S. Mission in Geneva for organizing this event, and also for you to meet with our, representative His Holiness Dalai Lama and the staff of the Office of Tibet. I think that's one of the rare events. And I could also see my friend, Ambassador Brownback, who came all the way to Dharamsala, and I've had the opportunity of meeting him several times. He has been a strong advocate for Tibet and also for religious freedom. He tried his best last November to get me enter the State Department after 6 decades. But because of his efforts, I think our special coordinator on Tibetan issues, Robert Destro, made it possible. So I want to thank both of them for acknowledging Central Tibetan administration, the democratic system that we have, the democracy that was gifted by His Holiness Dalai Lama to Tibetan people. So my entry into the State Department and recently to the White House amounts to recognizing and applauding the democratic system of the Tibetan people, for which I'm very, very grateful. Now, I think all of you shared your thoughts, essentially raise in detail the problems, the challenges that's going on in Tibet as far as religious freedom is concerned and reincarnation is concerned. I think, let me try to broaden this issue a little bit. I think, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said a few months ago, either we change China or China will change you, right? So China is a fundamental challenge for the world. It's a challenge on ideology, it's a challenge on values. So, this is the challenge we must all agree on. I think I also said right there at Geneva, where Ambassador Brownback is there, that, at the Geneva Forum, either we transform China or China will transform you. So hence, the challenge before us is whatever China says or the Communist Party of China says, the underlying deception and underlying threat to the universal values of democracy and human rights and religious freedom ought to be recognized and confronted. I think the days of cooperation leading to co-optation should be sidelined. Rather, even on trade, there has to be competition, but on values, there has to be direct confrontation as far as the Chinese government is concerned. For example, the sinologists and governments around the world laud and applaud the poverty alleviation project of the Chinese government, that they have lifted 500 million or so Chinese from poverty, which in itself is good. But what does poverty alleviation for people in Xinjiang, our Uighurs and brothers and sisters, mean? What does poverty alleviation for Tibetans mean? They uproot 1 million Uighurs and put them in concentration camps, put them in labor camps. That's what poverty alleviation means. Just this year, in the last 7 months of this year, right, Chinese government lifted 500,000 Tibetans from rural nomadic areas and put them in labor camps and give them military drills, military-like training to get them off of what? From their traditional cultural setting, to drive them away from their faith and religion, to away from their families. So this is what poverty alleviation means. So when Chinese government talks about being a leader of climate change and environment, we should always remember that they're exploiting natural resources in Mongolia, in Xinjiang, and in Tibet. So this we have to be very careful. Even at the UN, Human Rights Council, recently China was voted as a member of the Human Rights Council, essentially to be the judge of human rights violations taking place all over the world. How can they be a judge when they are the violator themselves, right? And how they are exploiting, manipulating United Nations system, including Human Rights Council. This, I think, the larger framework, the larger manipulation, larger tentacles of the Communist Party entering into, different international organizations ought to be known and highlighted. Now, specifically on religious freedom, there's a larger implication. Now, it's not just Tibetans. In 2007, Communist Party of China issued a document number 5, which is the basis on which the reincarnation will be recognized at the district level, state level, and the national level. Now, based on which they went about doing it and recognized 300 to 800, now ultimately 1,300 reincarnated lamas in Tibet. Can you imagine? So when the Communist Party of China issues a certificate, you are a legitimate lama. If you don't have that certificate, you are not a legitimate lama. Now Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader himself, has said, religion is poison, right? And it should be discarded with. And they destroyed 98% of monasteries and nunneries in Tibet. They destroyed 99.9% of monks and nuns. Even today, our monasteries and nunneries are destroyed. And then, monks and nuns are forced to commit suicide. Now, monks and nuns, they take a vow to spend their life in the monastery. When that is destroyed, they are thrown out. And you can watch a YouTube video where nuns are forced to sing and dance on stage where Chinese officials are watching on pop songs. So that kind of humiliation is taking place in Tibet. Now, with that, they say, well, we have the final authority to recognize reincarnated Lama, including the Dalai Lama. Now, so this is ridiculous, right? So this is simply unacceptable. And the whole world should realize that what they are trying to do, if you let Chinese government get away with recognizing reincarnation, they already have an agreement with the Vatican to recognize bishops. Next, it will be cardinal. Next, it could be even the Pope, right? Now, if they export this system to the rest of the world, other countries can say, well, if China can recognize, or Communist Party of China can recognize lamas, the bishops, the priests, the imams, the rabbis, then we should do the same. So what is happening in Tibet has a larger implication. So similarly, on poverty elevation, what they're using it against Uighurs and the Tibetans and the Mongolians, right? Similarly, on climate change, in the name of climate change, the environmental destruction that is taking place in Tibet, the natural resources being exploited in Tibet has a larger implication. Similarly, on religious freedom too, what's happening in Tibet will have larger implication. So hence, the challenge before us is either we change China to universal values, to international norms that we all agreed on, or China will change you. So this is a real challenge and this is a real threat. So what we ought to do, we have to change the framework, on which basis we deal with them. On human rights, we used to have bilateral dialogue, the government to government dialogue. Those ought to be discarded. It's no more effective. Multilateral approach, coordination of different parties coming together and pushing on China is the way to go. So including United States and European countries and all democratic countries, like-minded countries should come and coordinate and have a coalition to deal with China. That's the only way moving forward. So reincarnation, yes, it is a Tibetan business. Last October, we had a meeting of community leaders from all over the world. We passed unanimous resolution saying Dalai Lama will decide reincarnation. No one else will decide about his reincarnation. And in November of last year, all the spiritual leaders of the Tibetan Buddhism came to Dharamsala and unanimously passed a resolution. As far as reincarnation of His Holiness Dalai Lama is concerned, it is the business of Tibetan people and His Holiness Dalai Lama, no one else. Yes, China is a manufacturing hub. They make a lot of duplicates. But as far as reincarnation is concerned, it was invented by Tibetans. We have the original patent. So original is original, duplicate will be duplicate. So the whole world should realize it and come and rally with us. So with that, I want to thank Ambassador Brownback for officially hosting this event and officially endorsing this issue. And then my friend Ambassador Brownback and the special coordinator Destro have always been very supportive, and I could see my colleague Tenzin also there. So with that, I want to thank all of you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sangay, for your comments. It's really a great benefit to us to hear from you, and I really appreciate it. And I'm sure to all my colleagues here in Geneva, the diplomatic community, I'm sure they've gotten quite a great deal listening to you. So at this time, I'd like to open the floor for comments or a brief question or brief comment from some of our participants. Please remember to use the raise hand button at the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and we can ensure we can properly identify you before giving the floor. So we'll wait a second here. Okay, and I think I think for our first speaker, I see Tenzin Jaiso from the Tibet Network. The floor is yours. Please unmute.
Hi. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Unfortunately, I had some problem with the video. Hello?
Yep, we can hear you fine.
Okay. So I sincerely applaud U.S.'s effort in formulating a policy on the reincarnation of His Holiness. I had so much hope that India could have equally led this initiative to the international fora and given its roots of Buddhism and would have seemed moral to do so as well. So my question is for both Ambassador Brownback and Honorable President of my government. Given that India's Buddhist populace largely resides in the Himalayan belt, a vital frontier, and the large following of Buddhism in Southeast Asia, which an equally important frontier against China's expansion, the presence of Tibetan government exile in India, and the community followed by India's proximity to Tibet, where in all these does India's role lie? How crucial will India be to the larger discourse of the appointment of Buddhist leaders and the succession of the Dalai Lama? Thank you.
I think that was partly directed at Ambassador Brownback first and Dr. Sangay. So Ambassador Brownback, if you want to start.
Sure. I think India's role is critical. India has been fantastic on providing refuge for the Dalai Lama, providing a place for Tibetan Buddhism to organize and flourish. I was there, like I said, a year ago. A number of people have been and visited Dharamsala in that region. And India's hosting of the Tibetan Buddhist and the Dalai Lama has been fantastic and absolutely essential for Tibetan Buddhism to continue to prosper and have a place to move forth from. India has a lot of pressure on it from China with its proximity to China, and always has to and does carefully weigh everything regarding what happens with Tibetan Buddhism. I'm sure they're weighing this. They've always come down on the right side, or I shouldn't say always, but most of the time they come down on the right side, but they weigh things back and forth. So I have great respect and appreciation for the Indian government, what they've done for the Tibetan Buddhists and for hosting the Dalai Lama. I do hope they can be a strong voice on this one as they weigh and they balance the considerations back and forth. But they've been an essential for the Tibetan Buddhist.
Yeah, if I may, thank you, Tenzin Jaiso, for the question. You know, Prime Minister Modi ji was the second Prime Minister to visit Bodh Gaya, where Buddha got enlightened, the sacred, site for Buddhists, like Vatican or Mecca for, Catholics and Muslims. And then also he has participated in Buddha Purnima. That's the annual Buddhist event in India. I think he's one of the very few prime ministers who have participated in Buddhist events. So I think India has this age-old tradition. India has a lot of faith and a lot of leaders. For example, Shankaracharyas of Hindu tradition are, recognized by their followers, and Indian government respects that, right? So India has always respected people of faith selecting their own leaders. So I think, as far as Dalai Lama and reincarnation is concerned, I think India can reiterate the 1,000-year-old tradition. We respect all the faith and allow people of faith to select their own leaders. So hence, if His Holiness Dalai Lama decides to determine the next Dalai Lama, how and where and when he will come, an Indian government can say, this is age-old tradition. We always respected that, and we respect the reincarnation process decided by His Holiness Dalai Lama. So this will be in sync with their practice, with their belief, and also, as I said, Prime Minister Modi's visit to, Bodh Gaya, and participating Buddhist events. So they have shown their support for the traditional process.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to give the floor to Dulkan Issa from the World Uyghur Congress. Dulkan, you have the floor.
Yes. Well, thank you, Ambassador. It's so nice. So many distinguished guests, all friends, and speaking today, and my good friends, Lobsang Sangay and Sam Brownback, Ambassador Brownback. We met last year in person, but at least today I saw you. You didn't see me. I saw you by virtual. It is amazing. Yeah, thanks so much. It was a very excellent presentation. All saying the situation for all people, Uyghur, Tibet, Southern Mongolian, Hong Kongers, even Chinese civilians living under Chinese Communist Party's rule has deteriorated dramatically in recent years. In particular, in the last 5 years, we have witnessed strategy of the Chinese Communist Party shift to social reengineering of the Uyghur people, Tibetan people. Everything that make us unique, language, religious, culture has been targeted. Young generation of Uyghur Tibetan being targeted, in particularly for indoctrination, extremely targeting for religious. Today, Chinese Christian, Tibetan Buddhist, Uyghur Muslim, all is targeted by the CCP. And recently, ASPI, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, reported more than 8,000 most completely destroyed in Turkestan, another 8,000 most partly destroyed. Their report all use the satellite image. And recent events have made clear what happens to one community or in other region affects other as well. For example, Go, who was the party secretary in Tibet, he first tested human civilian monitoring system in Tibet. He set up network for police station, roadblocks, checkpoint, ensuring absolutely control over the Tibet. Then since 2016, he is the appointed party secretary in Turkestan. He used the same measure in Turkestan. And besides this, he tested digital surveillance technology and, for example, facial recognition, voice recognition on the Uyghur. He tested. Then later used in Tibet, other part of China. Today used Hong Kong and some other authoritarian countries also. So it is the time and US and some other European countries, particularly democratic nations, should be set up coalition. We are very thankful US government ready and take first concrete action and some sanctions, high-level Chinese Communist parties, members, officials, and also Chinese company puts a blacklist. But we haven't seen other country. We haven't seen any concrete action. So that's why not only US government doing this not good enough to stop this atrocity, because today democracy, global democracy, global human rights are threatened by the CCP. So, and all the countries should be set up coalition with the United States, and only way to stop the China's CCP's rule. My question is, does the situation in Tibet and East Turkestan require different response from the international community, or can they strengthen, make strong each other? This is the question for President Lobsang Sangay. And as for the second question, is United States removed from the Human Rights Council? This provides more chance to Chinese government. China now is trying to occupy all the places which US removed. And China now is a member of Human Rights Council, very aggressively stopping all the voice. So that's why is the United States going back to the UN Human Rights Council and the other international organizations. Thank you.
I think the question there, I think, may have been first directed to Dr. Sangay. You want to make a comment? And then maybe I might ask Assistant Secretary Destro if he'd like to make a comment in response as well. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, good to hear from my good friend Dokum Isa. So we all are together. I think the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, Mongolians, and the Hong Kongers, and people in Taiwan, we all should work together. This is, as far as values are concerned, this is Chinese Communist Party is a challenge to the whole world, and especially, to us and directly to us. We are facing the brunt of Communist Party's repression. 154 Tibetans have committed self-immolation. They have burned themselves. Why? Because they're saying the pain, the suffering, repression is unacceptable. It's unbearable. I would rather die than live under the system. What more can Tibetans say from Tibet to the rest of the world? Same with Uyghurs too. And your brothers and sisters are in labor camps. Your brothers and sisters are tortured like us, right? So yes, we all should work in coalition and coordination. Similarly, democratic countries all over the world, this is a challenge, a threat to the values, democratic values. We all should come together. So yes, China was voted to the Human Rights Council by 130 different countries. So don't take it lightly when they have 130 different countries saying China ought to be a member of the Human Rights Council to judge where human rights violation is. And that's, to say the least, it's a contradiction. In fact, it's a violation of the basic understanding of human rights. So all the countries coming together is very, very important.
Thank you. Bob, would you like to make a comment?
Yes, I would. I think that it's a really good question. One of the American founders, Benjamin Franklin, made a very important statement many years ago. He said, either we hang together or most assuredly we will hang separately. And I think that it's very important that we work together not only among the friends and colleagues in this conversation, but also to reach out across the international stage and to point out to people, that the Chinese understanding of victory here is that they get to control things, that basically you become their vassals. And so in order to do that, they have to have a comprehensive approach to the world. And we have to decide early on, right now, whether or not we want to bow to that oppression or not, whether or not we're going to accept the thought control and the information warfare that they practice or not. And I think the world has seen what they are capable of doing with respect to the virus, with respect to controlling information. That's what they're doing with respect to the Dalai Lama. And it's time for people around the world to stand up together and say, we're not going to take it. We need coordinated effort. We need it in the UN. We need it in regional places. We need it with respect to the neighboring countries, because the Chinese are not doing it just with respect to information. They're also controlling the water resources of the great rivers that flow from the Tibetan plateau. We need concerted effort around the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Next, I have Alan Cantos, Apoyo al Tibet, to recognize. Alan, please go ahead with your question or brief comment. If you can unmute.
Microphone.
Yes, we can hear you.
That's it. Okay, yeah. I would like to direct my question to mainly Lobsang Sangay and Tencho, but also to our American friends. But I know more my Tibetan friends from many years working together. And talking about world coordination, I first want to make a comment, and then my question would be at the end. As some of you know, Jose and I have been litigating against the Chinese government for various crimes, international crimes, including genocide. And we got so surprisingly successful that China struck back through the Spanish government, and they threatened the Spanish government to the point that they changed the law that we were using, the universal jurisdiction, to stop the Tibet cases that had reached orders of international arrest of several Chinese leaders. So here we have two things to watch. One is that it's not just China, it's that China, as Sangay has indirectly or directly pointed out, affects all the governments in the world by simply bullying and threatening. And I think it's important to stand together, and all the initiatives are brilliant, and I admire them and support them all. But I think there may be one that has only been used by Jose and I that I know of, which is the legal procedure, the international law, to hold China accountable for what can be defined and is perfectly defined as international crimes, both through national tribunals, but also through universal jurisdiction. There's two ways. We have to protect Tibetan rights when they are oppressed in countries such as US or Denmark, when they are wrongfully arrested, as well as what's happening in China. And going to the religious freedom in itself is very hard to litigate on Chinese ground, but it's not so bad when it is associated to other crimes like forced disappearance, like the Panchen Lama, torture, which is common to monks that don't go through the procedures or are found with pictures, and all that is part of the repression that has gone on in the past and that we denounced as genocide and other crimes. The religious freedom was associated with other crimes that can be addressed by extraterritorial litigation through countries like the US, Switzerland, France. There's brilliant lawyers out there, and it saddens me that it's only these two unknown Spanish mosquitoes that have got their hands in the job. And my question is, wouldn't this legal accountability, this universal accountability through the legal course, be a common horizon that we could open up together with everything else that has been mentioned, like United Nations, which is not a court of law, unfortunately. So this is my question. Could we also introduce the concept of international law, or are we that scared of China and the repercussions? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll see which of our panelists might want to take a response. I see Assistant Secretary Destro has unmuted, so I might go to him first.
No, this is a really, really good question. I think it's imperative that people inform themselves about the activities of China around the world. It's not just the activities in China. We need to have some concerted international efforts, not only to understand the deep penetration that China has in many other countries, the way in which they are holding economic hostages, and I think that religious freedom is a great place to start, because it's one that we can all agree on. We need some good UN language that everybody could sign on to, and then go from there. But we should also be thinking very seriously, when a country like Spain, feels under enormous pressure to modify its law, that's a problem. So it's not just the autonomy of Tibetan Buddhism to pick its own leaders. It's the autonomy of other countries and the sovereignty of other countries to make their own policies without being oppressed by the Chinese.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary Destro. If anyone of the other panelists wanted to make a brief comment, you can do so, Dr. Sangay, and then I'll let you speak, and then we'll go to, I think we have maybe one more question teed up. Go ahead, thank you.
So thank you, Alan. Alan and Jorge, they led this campaign under universal jurisdiction in the Spanish law to ban or make Chinese officials accountable. And they filed the case, and court has to accept the case. And finally, the verdict was, not about to be issued, but as the trial was going on, the Chinese government put so much pressure on the Spanish government that they amended the law and got rid of universal declaration, universal jurisdiction. So I think a year and a half ago, I was invited to Madrid to a major festival. And then initially, right? And then the Chinese embassy put so much pressure on the mayor and the city of Madrid that later I had to kind of participate unofficially, So they can put so much pressure. I mean, they essentially said visit of Chinese leaders to Spain will be canceled, if they go ahead with my participation in the event. So this is a reality. Having said that, now, U.S. Congress have passed the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, whereby all the Chinese tourists and officials and journalists are welcome to America, but equal access should be given to American diplomats and journalists and researchers to Tibet, including Tibetan Americans, right? Their parents are back home. They have not met them for 20, 30 years. The visa is used as a leverage to hold them hostage. Right? So that kind of punishment is given to Tibetans just because they are in America, they are American citizens. All they want to do is meet their dying and sick and old parents. And many Tibetans have not met their parents, not met their siblings, even though they have died, simply because Chinese government used visa as a leverage. So hence Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act and the Magnitsky Act, should be adopted in different countries and should be used against Chinese officials who are responsible for violating human rights of the Tibetan people, of our Uyghur brothers and sisters and Mongolians and people in Hong Kong. That's the only way moving forward.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. I think we have a question from Stephanie from Reuters. If we can move Stephanie in. And Stephanie, go ahead with your question. Please unmute. Stephanie, if you can unmute, go ahead.
Yes, hi, sorry. Is that, yes, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. I wondered a question for Mr. Destro, please. Early in the speech, I believe you referred to efforts by China. You said they were cajoling neighbors into signing treaties that would allow for forcible return of Tibetan refugees to China. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on that. And also just now, you referred to economic pressure and economic, you said they were holding some countries' economic hostages. I wondered if you could sort of address both of those things. Thank you.
Well, thanks for your question. It's a very good question. Let me, when you look at the neighboring countries around China, the Chinese have been pressuring Nepal in particular into signing some extradition and mutual border assistance treaties, and the Nepalese I think are doing a wonderful job in trying to protect their own sovereignty, and we support those efforts. In terms of the economic pressure that China is putting on other countries, we have seen. I can give you several examples. It's probably not good to burden this record with all of those, but one of the questions that we have seen is the deep penetration when you're looking at some of the Belt and Road Initiative contracts. You know, there's a great need for especially poor countries to understand what the fine print of these contracts means. I was told yesterday by an advocate to take a hard look at the fine print of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative in a certain West African country. And so, you know, there's a lot here. A lot to be discovered, and it's well worth it for all of you in the media to put your reading glasses on and get into the fine print of those contracts. Thanks.
Thanks, Assistant Secretary Destro, and thanks, Stephanie, for your question. I think this is going to conclude our question and comment portion, and we're going to come to closing remarks. So I'm just going to make a few quick observations myself, and I'll go back to each of our panelists for their closing thoughts before we wrap up. I just want to, again, thank our panelists for their really insightful comments, and I really want to speak mostly here to my fellow diplomat and Geneva-based missions that have joined us today. I think something that Dr. Sanjay said that's going to stick with me was, you know, that if we don't help work with China to respect human rights, China will change you. And I thought that was a really interesting comment that he made. I think we saw the kind of comments about how this encroachment on other countries' sovereignty, whether it's about what the discussion going on with regards to Spain, or what Assistant Secretary Destro said on Nepal, or how we see it attempts by their own government to pressure Americans or individuals that work for American companies around our own First Amendment protections while physically within our own country. This is a real challenge, and I think it's something that we need to take away. And I think looking at this issue that we've discussed today of religious freedom for Tibetan Buddhism, and, you know, obviously we talked about and that we heard again about the plight of, you know, Uyghurs and others in China. You know, we here in the international community have great concern about what's happening in Xinjiang, and one obvious concern is that the Chinese Communist Party has tried so effectively to hide and obfuscate what is going on. And what I found particularly important about this issue is that, and this issue for the international community, is that there will be no hiding it. This challenge around reincarnation and succession will come. And we in the international community are well aware of it ahead of time. And this is why this conversation, I think, is so important, because I think each one of us as member states need to prepare. Will we stand for fundamental human rights, for freedom of religion when this challenge comes? I think, sadly, the Chinese Communist Party has spoken that they intend to violate the freedom of religion. So it is a question to member states, as we prepare for when this eventuality will happen, will we be ready? And what will we say or do in the face of that challenge? So that's what I've taken away from this, and I want to appreciate everyone who's participated and who has attentively listened. So I'll go back, and we'll go back through kind of the order we started with. I'll turn it over to Assistant Secretary Destro for his closing remarks.
Well, thank you. I started out my remarks today by talking about what an honor it is to be there with you today. As Ambassador Bremberg has pointed out, that our first encounter was as an academic, and he knows probably better than all of you that I don't think a meeting is a success unless people have homework to do. You know, so I do believe that we need to come up with a good action plan coming out of this dialogue. Otherwise, all it is verbiage. You know, so I do really recommend that we have a little working group afterwards, that we come up with some suggested efforts to get the UN involved in all of this, and freedom of religion and belief, and especially the ability to choose your own religious leaders. That's a fundamental one. And I think if we start with the easier ones, it'll be a little bit easier down the road when we get to the more difficult ones. So thank you, Ambassador, for coordinating all this. Thanks to everybody who worked on it. And we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Destro. Ambassador Brownback, please.
Thanks, Ambassador Bremberg, and thanks everybody for tuning in for this. This is critically important. The communists ruled China for 70 years now and act as if impervious to international pressure because I think they view in many cases the international community won't come together and they can use their financial power to bully people to do what they want to. I think we really got to make a stand on this, or it will teach the Chinese communists that have ruled this country for 70 years a bad lesson. It'll teach them they can withstand, and they can appoint the head of a major religion with impunity. And what kind of a situation is that going to make for us in the world? This is really a critical moment. This is a united moment. The world agrees on religious freedom. They agree that Tibet Buddhism has the right to appoint its successor in its own way. But we stand. And my hope is that people are calculating that now and determining, yes, we will. And here's what we're going to be willing to do. Because the alternative that's not standing, I think, is really for this fundamental religious freedom right to fall into great jeopardy around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brownback. Now I'd like to turn to Tenzin Jaiso for your closing thoughts.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brownback. On behalf of International Campaign for Tibet, my colleagues who work with me, I want to thank you and all of your staff for helping us, bringing us all together and hosting this. Ambassador Brownback, Mr. Destro, Mr. Sangay, look forward to more work together. And Mr. Destro mentioned a working group. I really welcome such efforts. And just in closing, I thought I would just say, you know, when China occupied Tibet 60 years ago and exiled Tibet's political and spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, it was a very different country. At the time, China was a poor, backward country full of revolutionary zeal, paranoid and fearful of an outside world. And we forget it's only 60 years ago. And then it opened to the world in the 70s, and the world reciprocated by coming to China with the hopes that business investment and technologies will make China a better, freer society, will open it up. But in recent years, it's become clear that China has shown little interest in fairness, reciprocity in business dealings, in regards to religion and linguistic freedoms. It's just becoming more repressive, not less. So if China is to continue to prosper off the world's leading businesses, their creativity and technologies, the world must take it as an unnegotiable condition that China respect core values of cultural freedom, identities for all peoples, religious freedom, value of human rights, you know, for people in Tibet and Xinjiang and the whole of China. So I just wanted to say that as part of my closing at this session. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'd like to hear from Dr. Sangay, your closing comments. Thank you.
Ambassador Brownback, today we are talking about religious freedom and religion. You know, as a Buddhist, we always believe in karmic coincidence. You know, today happens to be the 49th day of former political prisoner Tana Jingme Sangbo, who spent 40 years in prison, right? He passed away 49 days ago, and 49 day is a very special and, a day to pray so we believe on 49 day his soul will depart, hopefully towards heaven. So today is the 49 day of a longest serving prison, who spent 40 years in prison. I think, this webinar is dedicated to him in spiritual sense. So this is karmic coincidence. And when I say this, that initially, either we transform China or China will transform you, it's a fact. Why we are having this event online? Why are we having this webinar? Because we cannot meet in person. Why? Because of the pandemic. Where did the pandemic originate? It originated in China. Because of lack of transparency, because of lack of democracy, because they don't respect human rights. They thought they can get away with it. They always act with impunity. They didn't tell us the information. They didn't share us the information about the pandemic, at the original stage, and then it caused this global pandemic. Now it has not just health crisis, social crisis, economic crisis. The whole world has paid a huge price because of this pandemic, and Chinese government should be made accountable. So that's why I say either we transform them or they will transform you. Whole world is transformed because of pandemic which originated in China. So unless we get our act together and fight for our values, that's democracy and human rights and religious freedom, they will impose your Pope on you, your Imam on you, your Rabbi on you, and your Lamas on you, and your Hindu priest on you, right? That's the day we don't want to see. That's why individual freedom, human rights is universal, and it should be inevitable. We all should work together to democratize China, because people in China do want democracy. People in China do want religious freedom. That's what they want. That's what we all want. That's the basic values that we all share, and China should embrace the universal values. So with that, the Tibet issue is not just the issue of 6 million Tibetans. It's the issue of the whole world. Tibet is the litmus test. You cannot say, I am for human rights, I am for democracy, but I cannot speak for Tibetans. You don't speak for Tibetans, then you are not for democracy, you're not for human rights, So today, I think I want to applaud the US mission in Geneva under the leadership of Ambassador Brownback for not just talking the talk, but walking the walk, saying religious freedom is important. We are officially going to host this event and send a message to all the diplomats in Geneva that we all should come together and host similar events where Tibetans and Uyghurs and Mongolians should be invited to speak about their issues. People in Hong Kong should be invited to speak about the challenges that they're facing. That's the only way moving forward. So yes, compete as far as trade is concerned. But when it comes to our values, fundamental values, we must confront Communist Party of China. So with that, thank you very much, Ambassador Brownback and Special Coordinator Destro and Tenzin Jaiso, and all the people who are watching through this, online event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sangay. We really appreciate your joining us and your comments today. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope everyone has found this discussion as helpful as I have, both as an education on Tibetan Buddhism and Dalai Lama's succession, and as a sobering reminder of how important defending freedom of religion and belief is. I look forward to continuing to discuss the issue of Tibet and religious freedom with all of you in the near future here in Geneva. And in the meantime, my team here at the U.S. Mission Geneva is always available to discuss your questions and concerns, and welcomes any recommendations on next steps and how our community at large can further engage on this important issue on behalf of the Tibetan people. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, great job.